The contract had 37 pages. Ethan Cole signed every single one without reading past the first paragraph. His hand was shaking, his son was dying 3 floors above him in that hospital, and the woman sitting across the mahogany table, cool, immaculate, watching him with eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, had just told him the surgery would be covered in full. All of it, every dollar. The only thing she wanted in return was a husband. Ethan pressed the pen to the last signature line and told himself he wasn't selling his soul. He was just borrowing against it. If this story already has you, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The letter from Mercy General arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad day because Tuesdays were when the rent was due and Ethan was 11 days behind. He'd been standing at the kitchen counter eating cold leftover rice out of the pot. No bowl, no spoon, just a fork he'd rinsed in tap water, when he heard the mail slot clatter. He almost didn't go. He knew what most envelopes looked like lately. White, official, demanding something from him that he didn't have, but he went anyway because ignoring things hadn't been working out for him. The envelope from Mercy General was thicker than the others. He tore it open standing in the hallway in his socks and read the first line twice because his brain refused to process it on the first pass. Total outstanding balance, $284,700. Payment required within 60 days to maintain active treatment status. He put the letter down on the floor. Then he sat down next to it. The hallway was narrow, one of those old apartment hallways where you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out, and he sat there with his back against the door and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since February, and he did the math he already knew the answer to. He had $412 in his checking account. He had a part-time job at a freight company that paid him $14.50 an hour and only called him in 3 days a week because they didn't want to give him benefits. He had a 7-year-old son named Noah who was on the 4th floor of Mercy General Hospital with a heart defect that had been misdiagnosed twice and was now, according to Dr. Reyes, progressing faster than we'd hoped. Dr. Reyes said a lot of things in that careful, measured voice that doctors use when they're trying not to say your child might die. Ethan had learned to translate. Progressing faster than we'd hoped meant they were running out of time. We need to discuss surgical options meant the surgery was the only option. I'd encourage you to look at all available resources meant she knew he was broke and was trying to be kind about it. He sat on that hallway floor for a long time. He'd tried everything that was supposed to work first. The hospital's financial assistance program had a 6-month backlog and required documentation he didn't have. Tax returns from a year when he'd been working under the table after losing his union job, pay stubs that didn't add up to enough anyway. He'd applied and been told, politely, to wait. He'd called his parents. His father had answered and listened for about 45 seconds before saying, "Ethan, you know we're on a fixed income," in that particular tone that meant the conversation was over. His mother had called back 20 minutes later and cried on the phone, which was worse somehow, because at least his father's coldness was clean. He'd looked into medical loans. The interest rates were predatory in a way that felt almost admirable in its shamelessness, 22, 26, 31%. He'd done the math on those too. Taking a loan to cover Noah's surgery would mean spending the next decade paying back an amount that grew faster than he could chase it. He'd thought about it for 3 days and then thought, Noah has to survive first before I can worry about debt. He'd applied for the loan anyway, been denied. His credit score had collapsed after the divorce, and the layoff had hit within 6 months of each other, and whatever the algorithm used to decide his worth had decided he had none. He'd sold everything that had any value. His truck, the good one, the one he'd actually owned free and clear, gone for $6,000 that had disappeared into copays and medication costs inside of 2 months. His guitar, his grandfather's watch, a collection of baseball cards he'd kept since he was 9 years old, stored in a shoebox under his bed, which a dealer on Craigslist had handed him $300 for while barely glancing at them. He was out of things to sell. He had started to understand, out of options entirely. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while he was sitting in Noah's hospital room watching his son sleep. Noah slept a lot now. The doctor said it was the medication, and Ethan believed them, but he also thought Noah slept because the kid was 7 years old and tired of being in a hospital bed, and sleeping was the one place where none of it could follow him. He had Ethan's coloring, dark hair, olive skin, and his mother's nose, which was the only thing about Vanessa that Ethan could look at without complicated feelings anymore. When Noah slept, his face went completely slack and peaceful, and he looked younger than 7. He looked like he was 4 again, before the diagnosis, before everything. Ethan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the 4th ring, mostly because sitting in silence watching his son breathe was starting to make him feel like he was losing his mind. Mr. Cole, the voice was a woman's, professional, clipped, the kind of voice that had been trained to communicate authority without being loud. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm calling on behalf of the Lennox family. Ethan didn't recognize the name. I think you might have the wrong number. I don't. You are Ethan Cole, father of Noah Cole, currently a patient at Mercy General under Dr. Reyes' care? A cold feeling moved through his chest. How do you know that? The Lennox family has considerable resources, Mr. Cole, and considerable interest in your situation. A brief pause. I'd like to arrange a meeting, tonight, if possible. I understand time is a concern for you. What kind of meeting? The kind where a proposal is made that may resolve your financial situation entirely. Another pause. I'd strongly recommend you come. He looked at Noah. The monitors beeped steadily. The IV line ran from the bag on the pole to the back of Noah's small hand, held in place with medical tape and a little foam airplane sticker that a nurse had put there to make it less scary. Where? Ethan said. But Ishushatiem. The address she'd given him was in the Harwick district, which was the kind of neighborhood where the houses didn't have numbers on the mailboxes because everyone who needed to find them already knew where they were. He took the bus because he didn't have a car anymore, and he sat in the back and watched the city change around him as they moved north. The bodegas and check-cashing places giving way to wine bars and boutiques. Then the boutiques giving way to the kind of blocks where there were no storefronts at all, just walls and gates, and the suggestion that things were happening behind them that weren't your business. He got off 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way because he needed the air and because he wanted to arrive having made some kind of decision about whether to walk away. He hadn't made it by the time he reached the gate. The Lennox estate, and it was an estate, not a house, not a home, an estate, sat behind a black iron fence that ran the length of the block. The main structure was stone and glass, 4 stories, with wings extending off either side that he could see through the iron bars were lit from within. There was a second building farther back that he couldn't quite make out. The grounds were immaculate in the way that requires full-time staff, and a level of resources most people spend their whole lives not acquiring. There was an intercom panel set into the gatepost. He pressed the button. Mr. Cole? Margaret Hale's voice, same clipped precision as the phone. Come through. The gate opened with a sound like an exhale. She was waiting for him inside the front door. Margaret Hale was perhaps 50, silver-haired, wearing a gray blazer that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. She shook his hand without warmth and led him through a foyer that smelled like old money. Polished wood, fresh flowers, a faint trace of something expensive he couldn't name. Thank you for coming, she said, in a tone that made clear she hadn't doubted he would. She brought him to a room that was clearly meant for exactly this kind of meeting. A sitting room, he supposed, though it looked more like a stage set. 2 chairs facing each other across a low table. A 3rd chair slightly to the side. Everything exactly placed. She gestured him to one of the facing chairs and sat across from him. The 3rd chair was empty. I'll be direct, she said, because I understand your situation doesn't leave a lot of room for extended conversation. Go ahead. The Lennox family needs a husband for their daughter, Sophia. She said it the way someone might say the Lennox family needs a new roof. Matter of fact, transactional. The arrangement would be contractual and temporary. 2 years. You would live at the estate, serve in the capacity of husband for social and legal purposes, and fulfill certain duties of care. Ethan stared at her. Duties of care. Sophia was in an accident 14 months ago. She has been... Margaret paused, choosing the word with some care. Recovering. She requires daily assistance and companionship. The family's staff handles medical requirements. What she requires is someone present, someone consistent. You're asking me to marry a stranger and move into this house? Yes? Because why me specifically? For the first time, something moved behind Margaret's composed expression. Not discomfort exactly, more like the recognition that she was going to have to say something that was true. Because you have leverage. You need something. Arrangements like this work better when both parties have something meaningful at stake. He thought about that. And what does Sophia get out of a husband she's never met? That's a matter between you and the family's attorneys. What concerns you is what you receive. She folded her hands. Noah Cole's surgery, all costs, including preoperative care, the procedure itself, postoperative recovery, and a 1-year follow-up plan, will be covered in full by the Lennox family. Additionally, you will receive a monthly living allowance for the duration of the contract and a settlement upon completion. The room was very quiet. In full, Ethan said. Every dollar. He thought about the letter on his hallway floor, the water stain on the ceiling, the baseball cards he'd sold for $300, Noah's small hand with the IV line and the foam airplane sticker. I want to meet her first, he said. Margaret's expression didn't change. That's not part of the... I'm not signing a contract to marry someone I've never seen. That's not negotiable. A silence. Then, I'll see what I can arrange. Cheb. They kept him waiting for 20 minutes in that sitting room. He didn't touch the water they'd put on the table. He sat and looked at the paintings on the walls. Large, abstract, the kind of art that's bought as a statement rather than because anyone likes it, and tried to think clearly about what he was doing. He kept arriving at the same place. Noah. Everything came back to Noah. When they finally opened the door at the far end of the room, it wasn't Margaret who came through it. It was a young woman in a wheelchair. She would have been striking even without the circumstances. Dark hair pulled back severely, bone structure that photographers would have paid attention to, dressed in a plain black top and dark trousers like she'd made a point of removing any invitation to be looked at. But what stopped Ethan cold was her face, which was turned slightly away from him even as she was wheeled into the room, as if she'd already decided not to fully arrive. The person pushing the wheelchair, an older woman in nurse's scrubs, positioned her a few feet away and then stepped back. For a moment, no one said anything. Sophia, Margaret said from somewhere behind Ethan, this is Mr. Cole. Sophia Lennox turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, close to black, and completely unreadable. She looked at him the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they've been told has been moved. Neutral assessment, no particular emotion, no welcome. Then she looked away again. She didn't speak. She understands everything you say, Margaret said quietly behind him. She simply chooses not to respond verbally at this time. At this time. Like it was a temporary operational status. Like she'd filed paperwork about it. Ethan looked at Sophia Lennox, at the rigid set of her shoulders, at the way her hands were folded in her lap with a precision that seemed controlled rather than natural. And he understood something without being able to articulate it. She was angry. Not at him specifically, just angry. At the room. At the arrangement. At whatever had put her in that chair and in this position and in front of a stranger who was being asked to pretend to be her husband. She was furious, and she was showing it by refusing to perform. He felt, unexpectedly, something almost like respect. I'm sorry about your accident, he said. She didn't look at him again, but he thought he saw something move in her jaw. A tightening. He looked at Margaret. I'll review the contract. The attorneys came the next morning. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he ate cold rice and read bad mail and tried to hold himself together, and went through 37 pages with 2 lawyers he'd never met who worked for a firm he'd never heard of. He didn't have his own lawyer. He couldn't afford one. He read every line himself, slowly, pausing to ask questions that they answered with careful neutrality that told him everything was legally binding and nothing was up for negotiation. The terms were what Margaret had described. 2 years. Full coverage for Noah's surgery and aftercare. A monthly allowance of $3,000, which felt like a fortune to him and was probably rounding error to the Lennox family. A settlement of $40,000 upon completion of the contract in good standing. He would live at the estate. He would attend whatever family or social functions Sophia was expected to appear at. He would not discuss the arrangement publicly. There was a clause about Noah. He could bring his son to live at the estate once Noah was cleared by his medical team for discharge. There was provision for Noah's ongoing care costs through the 2-year period. That clause, that single paragraph about Noah, was what made him pick up the pen. His hand shook, but not enough to stop him. Bachot. He told Noah that afternoon. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, and Noah was awake and relatively alert, which the nurses said was a good sign, even though his color was still wrong and his energy was still wrong and everything was still wrong. "We're going to move for a while," Ethan said. Noah looked at him with those dark eyes that missed very little. "Where?" "A house, a big one." He paused. "There's a woman who lives there. Her name is Sophia. She had an accident and she's in a wheelchair right now. We're going to help take care of her." Noah thought about this. "Is she nice?" Ethan thought about those dark, controlled eyes and a face that was refusing to perform anything. "I think she's going through a hard time." "Like me?" "Maybe. Different." "Okay," Noah said, with the easy acceptance that 7-year-olds sometimes managed and adults had mostly lost. "Is there a yard?" "A big one." "Okay," he said again, and settled back against his pillow, apparently satisfied. Ethan sat there a little longer than he needed to, just to feel that okay settle somewhere in his chest. He moved into the Lennox estate on a Saturday morning, which was 4 days after he'd signed the contract and 3 days before Noah's pre-surgical consultation. He brought 2 suitcases and a box of Noah's things: stuffed animals, books, the drawing tablet that had been Noah's last birthday present before everything went wrong. The housekeeper, a woman named Dora, who had the demeanor of someone who'd seen everything and commented on none of it, showed him to his room on the 2nd floor. It was larger than his entire apartment. He stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the high ceiling and the actual art on the walls and the window that looked out over the backgrounds, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not relief, not guilt, exactly. Something that was all three and none of them. A kind of vertiginous awareness that he had crossed some line, and the other side looked nothing like where he'd come from. "Sophia's quarters are through the conservatory," Dora said, from the doorway. She said it with the particular neutrality of someone who had been instructed to inform him of this without editorializing. "She keeps irregular hours. Meals are served at 7, noon, and 6, but she rarely joins them at the table." "Where does she eat?" "In the conservatory, mostly." Is she expecting me?" Dora looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite amusement. "Miss Sophia rarely expects anyone, Mr. Cole." He unpacked his 2 suitcases. It took about 20 minutes. The emptiness of the drawers and the closet after felt almost aggressive, like the room was pointing out exactly how little he'd brought with him. Then he went to find the conservatory. It was at the back of the house, off a corridor lined with family photographs that he made a point of not looking at too closely. The door was glass-paned, and through it he could see green, a lot of green, plants in various stages of elaborate growth, light coming through the glass ceiling in the flat gray way of overcast afternoon. He knocked, which felt absurd on a glass door where she could obviously see him, but seemed like the right thing to do. No response. He opened the door. The conservatory was larger than it had looked from outside, and warmer, a humid warmth from all the plants, which were everywhere, on shelves and hanging from the ceiling and growing in large clay pots arranged across the stone floor in some pattern that might have been deliberate or might have been accumulated over time. The air smelled like soil and leaves and something floral he couldn't identify. Sophia was at the far end, her wheelchair positioned in front of the largest glass panel, looking out at the back garden. She was in the same kind of dark, simple clothing as the night before. Her hands were in her lap. She wasn't doing anything. No book, no phone, no task. Just sitting. Ethan walked through the plants, stepping around pots, until he was a respectful distance away. "Hey," he said. She didn't turn. "I moved in this morning. Figured I should, not just exist in the house without introducing myself properly." He stopped. That had sounded fine in his head. Out loud, it landed a little flat. I'm Ethan. You probably know that. Nothing. He looked at the garden through the glass. It was well maintained, someone spent a lot of time on it, with a stone path running through it and what looked like a fountain at the far end that wasn't running. My son's name is Noah, he said. He's 7. He'll be staying here once he's out of the hospital. I thought you should know that. He's pretty quiet for a 7-year-old, actually. The nurses say it's the medication, but I think he was always a little on the quiet side. He paused. He asks a lot of questions, though, just so you're prepared. Nothing. But she hadn't turned away either. She was still facing the window and he couldn't see her face, couldn't read anything. I'm not going to pretend this isn't a strange situation, he said. Because it obviously is. But I'm not going to be a problem for you. I just want to say that. I'll stay out of your way if that's what you want. He thought about what he'd seen the night before, the controlled fury behind that controlled face. Though I suspect you've had enough people staying out of your way. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, I'll let you know when Noah arrives, in case you want to. I don't know, just so you know. He turned and started back through the plants. He was almost at the door when he heard it. Barely, almost not there, at the very edge of audibility. Not a word. Not a response, exactly. Just a sound. A breath that might have been the beginning of something that she'd decided not to finish. He didn't turn around. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Some instinct that turning around would be the wrong move would put too much weight on something that might be nothing. He kept going through the door and back into the corridor, and stood there a moment with his hand on the glass. Through it, he could see her still hadn't moved. Noah's pre-surgical consultation was on Tuesday with a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Ellison, who had the particular kind of calm that came from having done a thing so many times that almost nothing about it was surprising anymore. He walked Ethan through the procedure with diagrams and terminology and the practiced language of medicine, and Ethan listened to all of it and understood maybe 60% and asked questions about the other 40% until Dr. Ellison had answered everything twice. His age is actually an advantage, Dr. Ellison said at the end. Children's hearts are more adaptable. We have every reason to expect a good outcome. But not certain. Medicine isn't certain, Mr. Cole. But this is as close as I can give you. He sat with Noah afterward. Noah had colored pictures on his tablet while Ethan was in with the doctor. A house, trees, what looked like a dog but might have been a horse, and held them up for Ethan's review with the serious expression of someone presenting a portfolio. That one's the house, Noah said, pointing to the large structure in the middle of the picture. The new one. I made it really big. It is really big. Is there really a garden? Yeah, a big one. Noah added a sun to the top corner of the drawing, pressing his stylus with great deliberateness. Okay, I want to see it when I'm better. You will, Ethan said. He said it the way you say things when you don't have room not to believe them. Bob. The first week at the estate was like learning the geography of a foreign country. The staff were professional and largely invisible, appearing when needed and absent when not, communicating through Dora, who seemed to function as the household's central nervous system. There were rules that hadn't been written down, or if they were, no one had given him the document, that he learned through trial and error. Don't use the East Wing corridor after 9 because the floors were being treated. Leave breakfast dishes in the scullery, not the main kitchen. The landline in the study was for household business only. He learned the shape of Sophia's days by proximity. She was in the conservatory in the mornings, always. He could see the glass doors from the second-floor landing when he came down, and she was always already there, her wheelchair facing whatever light was available. She went to her rooms in the early afternoon, which he knew because he'd hear the slight mechanical sound of her chair in the corridor below. She returned to the conservatory later, after dinner, and stayed sometimes until very late. She didn't come to meals. She barely appeared anywhere else in the house. On the 4th day, he brought her coffee. Not as a grand gesture, just he was making himself coffee in the morning and the conservatory was on the way to nowhere in particular, and he had a cup in each hand when he knocked on the glass. She was turned away from the door again, facing the window. He opened the door and crossed through the plants and set the second cup on the small table beside her wheelchair. He didn't say anything, just left it there and went back out. He didn't look back to see if she touched it. He did it again the next morning, and the next. On the sixth morning, when he came through the door, he found the previous day's cup had been moved, just slightly, a few inches from where he'd placed it, in a way that could have been the staff tidying or could have been her reaching for it at some point. There was no way to know. He set the fresh cup in the same spot and left. Noah's surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Ethan had been given a car, part of the arrangement, a sensible sedan he hadn't asked for, and he drove to the hospital every morning and stayed until early evening, then came back to the estate for whatever meal Dora had arranged for him, then went back to that too-large room and slept imperfectly. He started bringing work with him to the hospital. Not his old freight company job. He'd quietly let that go because the estate allowance was enough and the schedule didn't work and he needed to be available. He started picking up freelance logistics work online, things he could do with a laptop and a phone while sitting in hospital waiting rooms and corridors. It didn't pay much, but it kept him from feeling like he was just waiting. He'd never been good at just waiting. On the 11th day, he came back to the estate later than usual. Noah had had a harder afternoon, fatigue and some chest discomfort that turned out to be nothing serious but had cost Ethan about 3 hours of controlled terror, and he was still carrying the tension of it when he walked past the conservatory. The light inside was different, lower, evening light. He could see Sophia through the glass, and she was not in her usual position facing the window. She was turned sideways, looking at something in her lap. As he watched, she moved, just her hands, slowly, and he realized she was holding something, a small plant, a cutting from one of the pots. She was touching the leaves, one by one, with the kind of careful attention that you'd give to something that might break. He stood there for only a second before moving on, because watching felt wrong, but he carried that image with him up to his room, those hands, careful on the leaves, and thought about it longer than made sense. She wasn't gone. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had decided she'd become unreachable, she wasn't gone. Something in there was still paying attention to things, still caring about small, fragile things in her hands. He didn't know why that mattered to him, but it did. Boss, Noah asked about her again, the following week. The lady in the wheelchair, he said. What's wrong with her? She had an accident. Her legs don't work right now. Is she sad? Ethan thought about those eyes, that controlled, furious silence. I think she's going through something hard, yeah. Does she have anyone? The question hit him somewhere unexpected. She has her family. Noah turned back to his tablet with the expression of someone who found that answer insufficient. That's not always the same, he said, at 7 years old, with the casual wisdom of a child who'd been through enough to know the difference. It was on the 16th day that the first real thing happened. Ethan had been in the estate's small library, mostly decorative, but there were actual books if you looked past the arrangements, when he heard Dora's voice in the hall, lower than usual, and then the sound of the wheelchair. He came out of the library in time to see Sophia's chair rounding the corner at the end of the corridor. She wasn't heading to the conservatory. She was heading toward the front of the house, toward the main staircase and the formal rooms beyond. He almost went back into the library. Then he followed, at a distance, because something about the purposefulness of her movement was different from the careful, contained movements he'd been watching for 2 weeks. She stopped at the entrance to the formal sitting room, the same one where he'd first seen her, where the lawyers had presented him with 37 pages of his life being reorganized. She sat in the doorway and looked into the room. From his position in the corridor, he could see her profile. He could see that her jaw was tight, and her hands were gripping the wheelchair arms in a way that was different from her usual careful positioning. He stayed where he was. After a minute, she turned her head and looked directly at him. He hadn't been quiet enough, or she'd known he was there all along. He didn't look away. Sorry, he said. I wasn't trying to... I'll go. She stared at him. He waited for the dismissal, the turned head, the return to silence. Instead, she held his gaze for what felt like a long time. And in those dark, unreadable eyes, he saw something shift. Not softening, exactly. Nothing as clean as that. More like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, and someone had just touched the handle from inside. Then she turned away from him and rolled her chair back down the corridor toward the conservatory, and he stood in the hallway alone. But that night, when he set the coffee cup on the table beside her chair, She reached out and took it before he'd even stepped back. He kept his face completely neutral, walked back out through the plants, got to the corridor, and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 16 days. Quote, the call from Dr. Reyes came the following morning at 6:47, while Ethan was still in bed and the light outside was barely gray. He answered before the second ring. Mr. Cole? Her voice had that careful, measured quality, but underneath it something urgent. I need you to come in. Noah had an episode overnight. His heart rate destabilized. He's stable now, but I need to speak with you in person about accelerating our timeline. He was in the car in 7 minutes. The drive to Mercy General was 30 minutes in morning traffic, and Ethan spent all of it not thinking about the conservatory or the coffee cup or dark eyes behind glass. He spent it thinking about Noah drawing a sun into the corner of a picture of a house he hadn't seen yet. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw so tight it ached, and he did not let himself arrive at any of the conclusions that were waiting for him at the end of that road. Not yet. Not until he got there and could see for himself. Noah's room was on the 4th floor, and Ethan took the stairs instead of the elevator because his legs needed something to do. Dr. Reyes met him in the corridor outside Noah's room. She was already in her white coat at 7 in the morning, which meant she'd probably been there since before Ethan had gotten the call. He'd always respected that about her. She wasn't the kind of doctor who appeared only for the formal conversations. How bad? He said, before she could open with anything measured. She didn't flinch at the directness. The episode lasted about 4 minutes. His heart rate spiked and then dropped. The night team responded quickly and he stabilized without intervention. He's sleeping now. She paused. But it's a signal, Ethan. His heart is under more strain than the last round of imaging showed. We need to move the surgery up. How far up? I want him on the table in 10 days. He absorbed that. 10 days ago had been the day he'd moved into the Lennox estate. 10 days from now felt like no time at all, and also like forever, in the way that all deadlines did when something irreversible waited at the end of them. Okay, he said. I know it's okay. Whatever he needs, do what you need to do. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who was also seeing the person in front of them, not just the case file. He's a strong kid, Ethan. I mean that. He nodded because speaking felt risky. Then he went in to see his son. Noah was asleep, just as she'd said, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of the monitors. Someone had adjusted his blanket so it was tucked around him evenly, and his tablet was on the tray beside him, still open to whatever he'd been drawing before everything happened. Ethan sat in the chair beside the bed and put his hand near Noah's, not touching, just close. He sat that way for a long time. Outside the window, the city was waking up. He could hear the distant sound of traffic, the particular layered noise of a morning that was ordinary for everyone else in it. He stayed until Noah opened his eyes. Hey, Dad? His voice was small and still half asleep. Hey, buddy? Noah blinked at the ceiling for a moment. Did something happen last night? Your heart had a rough patch. The doctors sorted it out. It woke me up, Noah said, matter-of-factly. It felt weird. Ethan kept his hand near Noah's and said nothing for a beat. Did it scare you? Noah thought about it with the deliberate honesty of a kid who hadn't learned to perform feelings yet. A little, but then the nurse came and she let me have apple juice. That's good. She said I was brave. You are. Noah turned his head to look at him. Are you okay, Dad? You look like you didn't sleep. I slept, Ethan said, which was technically true, even if 4 hours barely qualified. You look like when you're trying not to be worried. He looked at his son, 7 years old, hooked to monitors, having just had a cardiac episode in the night, and currently asking if Ethan was okay, and felt something so large and complicated move through his chest that he had no name for it. I'm good, he said. I'm right here. Noah seemed to accept this. He turned back to the ceiling, then reached for his tablet. I'm going to draw the garden, he announced. The one at the house. I want to get it right before I see it. You've never seen it. I know. I'm going to imagine it and then see if I got it right. He said this with complete confidence, like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. That's how you figure out if you were paying attention to the right stuff. Ethan watched him open a new canvas and start making careful marks, and thought that Noah was, without question, a better person than he was. He always had been. He drove back to the estate in the late morning, after Noah had eaten breakfast and fallen back asleep, and Dr. Reyes had gone over the revised surgical schedule with a resident who wrote everything down twice. The drive felt longer than it had in the early morning panic. He had more room in his head now, and the things he'd been keeping out were moving back in. The numbers, the logistics, the fact that he'd have to call Dr. Ellison's office to move the pre-op consultations, that he'd need to arrange for someone at the hospital to have his contact information in 3 separate places so nothing got lost. He parked in the estate's side lot and sat in the car for a minute, looking at the stone facade of the main house through the windshield. He'd been living here for over 2 weeks, and it still felt like someone else's house. Not in a bad way exactly, more like he was always aware of it, the way you're aware of borrowed clothes. They fit fine, they just weren't yours. He went inside and almost ran into Dora in the entryway. "Mr. Cole?" she said, and then stopped, reading whatever was on his face with the competence of someone who'd spent decades managing a household full of difficult people. "Sit down. I'll bring you something." "I'm fine. You look like you haven't eaten. Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table, the actual kitchen, not the formal dining room, and she put coffee and toast in front of him without ceremony, which was exactly right. He ate without tasting it, and told her about the surgery being moved up. She listened, nodded, and said she'd make sure the household schedule accommodated whatever he needed. "Miss Sophia asked about you," she said, when he was on his second cup of coffee. He looked up. "Asked? She talked to you?" "Not in so many words. She was in the conservatory when you left this morning. When you didn't come for the coffee, she—" Dora paused, and he could see her choosing precision over interpretation. "She looked down the corridor twice. Then she sent me out to check if your car was in the lot." Ethan turned this over. "She noticed I was gone." "She notices more than people give her credit for," Dora said, in a tone that suggested this was not a new observation. He finished his coffee, then went to the conservatory. She was in her usual position, chair facing the far glass panel, looking out at the garden. The morning light was coming through at a low angle that lit up the plants around her and made the conservatory look like something from a painting. He crossed through to her and set nothing down because he hadn't brought coffee this time. He just came and stood, not too close, at the edge of her sight line. "Noah's surgery is in 10 days, he said. They moved it up. He had an episode last night. His heart." He stopped, felt the blunt inadequacy of those words. "He's okay. He's stable. But they need to do it sooner." The garden outside was still and gray. An overcast day, the light flat and uniform. "I'm not—" He stopped again, ran a hand over the back of his neck. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. I just figured if I'm going to be in your house, and you're going to notice when I'm not here, you should probably know what's happening." Sophia's hands shifted in her lap, just slightly, the kind of movement that might mean nothing. "He wants to see the garden," Ethan said, "when he gets out. He's been drawing it, imagining what it looks like. He's got this thing where he tries to picture something accurately before he sees it, and then checks afterward if he was right." He looked through the glass at the stone path and the dry fountain. "He's going to be disappointed about the fountain. He's definitely got it running in his version." Something changed in her face. He caught it only because he'd been watching carefully, not for what she'd show, but for the texture of what she was doing with her silence. A small thing, the faintest softening around her mouth. Not a smile, not close to a smile, but the muscles releasing something, just briefly, that they'd been holding. "I'll be back for dinner," he said, because that was all that was left to say. "If you want the coffee, I'll bring it tomorrow." He turned to go. 10 days? The voice stopped him cold. He turned. She was still facing the window, hadn't moved her body toward him at all. Her hands were still in her lap, but the words had been hers. Low, slightly rough with disuse, like a door opening on old hinges. "Yeah," he said, when he trusted himself to speak evenly. 10 days. She didn't say anything else. He stood there for another second, then walked back through the plants and out the door, and didn't stop until he was in the corridor with the glass behind him. 2 words. 2 words after 2 weeks of nothing. He stood very still in the hallway and felt the weight of them. Set. He didn't make a thing out of it. That felt important. Not to show up the next morning with some kind of changed energy, not to treat her words like a prize he'd won. He came to the conservatory the following morning with the coffee and set it down and said, "Morning?" in the same neutral tone he'd been using, and moved back out without waiting. He heard the cup shift on the table before the door closed behind him. In the afternoons, he went to the hospital. Noah was stable, eating more than he had been, and occupying himself with an elaborate ongoing drawing project that had evolved from the garden into something that appeared to be an entire neighborhood. He'd given each house a family and was now working on what he called the in-between places, the streets and sidewalks and corners where people passed each other without knowing it. "That's the lady," Noah said one afternoon, pointing to a small figure he'd drawn in a window of one of the houses. "Which lady?" "The one at the house. Sophia." He'd said her name without any particular weight, the way kids absorbed and deployed information. "I drew her looking out a window because you said she likes the garden." Ethan looked at the small figure, just a shape, really, a few deliberate lines that Noah had decided represented a person in a window. "How'd you know she likes the garden?" "Because you told me she's in the glass room a lot, and the glass room looks at the garden." He shrugged. "So she must like it." "That's pretty good reasoning." "I know." Noah added a detail to the window, a frame, something growing on the sill. "Do you think she'll like me?" The question landed with unexpected force. "Why wouldn't she?" "Some people don't know how to be around kids when they're sad," Noah said, with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who'd spent enough time around adults in hospitals to develop opinions on the matter. "They get weird." "She might," Ethan admitted. "She's going through something hard." "So am I," Noah said. "Maybe that's okay then." He went back to drawing. Ethan sat with that for a long time. Sophia spoke again 4 days later. He'd been crossing the corridor near the conservatory when the door opened. Not the glass conservatory door, but the side door that connected to a smaller room he'd understood was some kind of sitting room for her personal use. She came through in her wheelchair, moving with the controlled efficiency he'd gotten used to watching, and nearly rolled into him because he'd stopped in exactly the wrong spot. "Sorry," he said, stepping back. She stopped the chair, looked up at him with those dark eyes. At close range, her face was harder to read, not easier. Too much going on in it, too many things that had learned to coexist behind that surface. She said, "Why do you keep bringing the coffee?" He almost smiled because it was such a direct question after all that silence, like she'd been saving her words for something worth spending them on. "I make it anyway," he said. "Seems wasteful not to." "You could pour it out." "I could." She studied him. "You're not going to explain it more than that. There's not much more to it." Something shifted in her eyes. Not softening, not warming, but a kind of recalibration. Like she'd had an expectation and he'd failed to meet it in a way that surprised her. She started rolling forward, moving past him down the corridor. "The coffee is too strong," she said, without stopping or looking back. He watched her go. "I'll fix it tomorrow." She didn't respond, but she also didn't tell him to stop. He fixed the coffee. Slightly less of everything, slightly more water. He had no idea if he'd gotten it right, but the next morning the cup had been moved again. And the morning after that, she was already facing the door when he came in, which was different from how she'd always been positioned before. Back to the room, face to the window. He set the cup down. She reached for it while he was still standing there, which was new. "How is your son?" she said. He felt the surprise, but absorbed it. "Surgery in 3 days. He's holding up. He's a tough kid." She looked at the cup in her hands. "How old?" 7. She was quiet for a moment. The conservatory was warm around them, the plants pressing in from every side with their damp green presence. 7 is old enough to understand that something is wrong, she said, but not old enough to understand why. "Yeah." He paused. "He seems to handle it better than I do, honestly." "Children do that," she said. Not warmly, exactly, but with an authenticity that was different from the careful performance of sympathy. She meant it. They adapt. Adults decide how they're going to feel about something and then get stuck there. He looked at her. Is that what happened to you? The question came out before he'd fully decided to ask it, and he felt the immediate awareness that it might have been too much, too direct, too soon. She looked back at him with those dark eyes, and for a moment he thought the door was going to close again. That careful, controlled silence reassembling itself around her. But she said, something like that. Then she turned back to the window, and he understood the conversation was over. He left the conservatory and went to start his morning. The sentence stayed with him all day, something like that. It wasn't an answer, but it was something she'd decided he was allowed to have. The night before Noah's surgery, Ethan couldn't sleep. He was in his room at the estate, in that large bed that still felt borrowed, staring at the ceiling the way he'd stared at the water stain in his old apartment hallway, doing math he couldn't stop. The surgery was 8 hours. Dr. Ellison had said 8 hours, maybe less, probably not more. He would be in a waiting room for most of that time. He would have his phone and his laptop, and he would be unable to focus on anything except the fact that his son's chest would be open. At 2 a.m, he got up and went downstairs because the ceiling wasn't doing anything useful. The house was quiet in a specific way. The particular silence of a large building at night, full of small sounds that became audible only because the larger ones were gone. The hum of appliances, a settling sound from somewhere deep in the walls, his own footsteps on the hallway floor. He went to the kitchen and stood in front of the refrigerator for a while without opening it, then went to the corridor that ran alongside the conservatory. The lights inside were low, not off, but dim, the way they sometimes were late at night. He could see through the glass panels. He expected to see the conservatory empty. Sophia was there. She was in the middle of the space, not in her usual spot by the window. She'd positioned herself near one of the larger plant groupings, a cluster of broadleaf things that came up to shoulder height. And she had her hands in among the leaves, not the careful one-finger touching he'd seen before, but both hands, moving through the foliage in the slow, deliberate way of someone who found it steadying. He stood in the dark corridor and watched her and felt with some clarity that this was a private thing he wasn't supposed to see. Not private the way the lawyer's documents were private. Private the way a person is private when they think no one is looking, unguarded, unperformed, just present in themselves. He started to move away. She turned her head and saw him through the glass. He stopped, made a small, useless gesture with his hand, not a wave, more like an acknowledgement that he'd been caught, then pointed down the corridor in the direction of the kitchen, miming making coffee. An offer. A ridiculous thing to mime through glass at 2 a.m. She looked at him for a moment, then she moved her chair toward the conservatory door. He went to make the coffee. She came into the kitchen 4 minutes later and positioned her chair at the end of the kitchen table, the position where you sit when you're not sure if you're staying. He set a cup in front of her, less strong than the original, adjusted the way she'd told him to, and sat down at the side of the table with his own. Neither of them said anything for a bit. The kitchen was warm and slightly too bright after the dark corridor. "Can't sleep," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I rarely do," she said. "Because of the pain." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Because when I sleep, I dream about walking, and then I wake up." He looked at his coffee. "That sounds awful." "It was worse at first," she said. She wasn't looking at him, was looking at the table, but she was talking, actually talking, with sentences that had weight in them, not the careful minimum of their other exchanges. "Now it's just there, like something that's always there when I wake up." "How long has it been?" 14 months. She said it without inflection, the way you say the number of steps in a staircase. "Since the accident. They told me you were recovering. That's what they tell people." The kitchen was quiet. He could hear the refrigerator again. Outside, some night bird made a sound and then stopped. "My son is in surgery tomorrow," he said. "Today, I mean. In a few hours." "I know. I keep doing math in my head, like if I calculate the odds enough times I can change them." "Does it help?" "No." "Then stop doing it." He almost laughed. Not at her, but at the bluntness of it, the way she said it like the solution was obvious and he was being irrational, which he was. Yeah. She looked at him then properly from across the corner of the table. Her face was different in the kitchen light than it was in the conservatory, less composed or composed in a different way, like the particular performance she kept for daytime had been partly dismantled by the hour and the dark outside. "He'll be all right," she said. "You don't know that." "No, but I'm saying it anyway." A pause. "Sometimes that's what you need. Not the odds. Just someone saying it." He looked at her. Dark eyes. The set of her jaw that was always slightly tight, always slightly braced. The hands around the cup that gripped a little too hard, the way his own hands did when he was holding on to something. "Thank you," he said. She gave a small, barely there nod. Then she looked back at the table, and they sat there in the too bright kitchen until the coffee was cold, and neither of them filled the silence with anything unnecessary. He was at the hospital by 6:15. They took Noah into pre-op at 7:40, and Ethan walked alongside the gurney for as far as they'd let him, which was to the double doors at the end of the pre-op corridor. Noah was groggy from the medication they'd already started, but awake enough to grip Ethan's hand. "Dad?" "Right here." "Tell Sophia about the garden when I wake up," Noah said, with a kind of drowsy certainty. "Tell her I want to fix the fountain drawing." "I'll tell her." "And tell her—" He trailed off, fighting the pull of the sedative. "Tell her I said hi." "I'll tell her." The orderly smiled gently at Ethan over Noah's head. He let go of his son's hand when the doors opened and watched the gurney go through and stood at the window set into the doors until Noah was out of sight. Then he turned and walked to the waiting room and sat down, and did not check the odds a single time. He thought about a kitchen table at 2 a.m. and a woman with her hands in the leaves of plants in the dark, and coffee that was slightly less strong than it used to be, and he stayed with those thoughts instead of the other ones. 7-year-old boys were tougher than they looked. Dr. Ellison had said so. Noah had said so in his way, without saying it at all. He sat in the waiting room with his hands clasped between his knees, and he waited. The surgery took 9 hours and 40 minutes. Ethan knew it was running long because Dr. Ellison had said 8 hours, maybe less. When the clock on the waiting room wall passed 8 hours and kept going, Ethan stopped looking at it and stared at the floor instead, at a scuff mark near the leg of the chair across from him that looked like it had been there since the building was new. A nurse came out at the 9-hour mark and told him everything was progressing, which was not the same as everything was fine, and Ethan nodded and thanked her and went back to the scuff mark. His phone had 11 texts on it. Dora had sent 2, careful and brief. Margaret Hale had sent one that was more formal than personal. His mother had sent 4 that he couldn't read right now. And there were 2 from a number he'd recently saved under just an initial, S, that said, in sequence, any update. And then 20 minutes later, he'll be all right. He stared at the second one for a long time. She'd said it again. Not a question, not a hedge. Just a statement, the way you'd state a fact you'd decided to commit to regardless of the evidence. He typed back, "Still in, going long," then sat with the phone in his hand and waited. When Dr. Ellison finally came through the double doors at 9 hours and 40 minutes, Ethan was on his feet before the surgeon had crossed half the distance between them. He read Ellison's face in the first second, the specific looseness around the eyes of someone who'd been under sustained pressure for hours and was now releasing it, and understood before the words came. "He did well," Ellison said. "Better than I expected, honestly. There was a complication midway through, some irregular tissue around the repair site, but we handled it. He's in recovery. You'll be able to see him in about an hour." Ethan put his hand on the wall beside him, just for a second, not because he was falling, just because he needed something solid. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended. Ellison put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the kind of contact that surgeons learn to deploy precisely, neither too much nor too little, and then excused himself. Ethan stood at the wall for another moment, then went and sat back down and typed to the S in his contacts. "He's out. He did well." The response came in under a minute. Just, "Good." One word. But he sat with it like it weighed something. Post. Noah spent 4 days in the ICU and then moved to a regular room, which Dr. Reyes described as ahead of schedule in a way that told Ethan she was genuinely pleased rather than just managing his expectations. He had tubes and monitors and an incision that a nurse showed Ethan how to check for signs of infection with a matter-of-factness that Ethan appreciated, because it gave him something concrete to do with his anxiety. Noah was tired in the specific post-surgical way, deep down tired, bone tired, the kind that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the body redirecting all its resources toward repair. He slept most of the first 2 days and was awake in stretches of 1 or 2 hours that he mostly spent asking questions. "Did you tell her?" he asked on the second day. His voice was thin from the intubation, but the directness was still intact. "Tell who what?" "Sophia, about the fountain drawing." He said it like Ethan might have forgotten, which was fair, given that Ethan had been operating in a state of barely contained crisis for 4 days. "Not yet. I'll tell her. Tell her I'm working on a better version. I think I had the shape wrong." He gestured at his tablet on the tray, which he'd had Ethan bring from the estate but hadn't yet opened. "I want to get it right before I give it to her." Ethan looked at his son. "You're going to give it to her?" "As a present, when I come home." He said home without any visible awareness of what that word meant in this context, and Ethan let it go, because Noah was right. It had become home in some way neither of them had planned. "She'll like that," Ethan said, and believed it, which surprised him slightly. He drove back to the estate each evening, slept, drove back to the hospital each morning. The rhythm of it was exhausting and also steadying in the way that routines became when everything else was uncertain. On the third evening, he found Sophia in a different part of the estate than he expected. Not the conservatory, not her rooms, but the small study at the end of the east wing that he'd been told was rarely used. The door was open and she was inside, her chair positioned before the large desk, and she had papers in front of her. When he knocked on the open door, she looked up, and something crossed her face that might have been caught off guard, which was not an expression he'd seen on her before. "Sorry," he said reflexively. Dora said, "I was looking for the household schedule, for when Noah comes home, the medical setup." "It's on the desk in the main study," she said. "Second drawer." "Okay." He started to pull back. "He's doing well," she said. He stopped. "Yeah, ahead of schedule, they're saying." She nodded. She had the particular stillness that he'd come to understand was her version of attention. Not absence, but a kind of gathered focus that she turned on things she actually cared about. "What are you doing?" he asked, because the papers in front of her had clearly been something she was actively working on, and the question came out before he decided whether to ask it. She looked at the papers. "Reading," she said, which was technically an answer. "Okay." "Documents," she said after a beat. "Legal things." She seemed to make some small internal decision because her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a degree of opening. "My brother's." He didn't know she had a brother. That information wasn't in anything Margaret Hale had presented to him, wasn't in any of the careful briefings about Sophia's condition and care and history. "I didn't know you had a brother." "No one talks about him," she said. The sentence was flat and precise in a way that told him exactly what that meant. "His name is Daniel. He's 3 years older than me." He came in a little further, not all the way to the desk, but past the doorway. "What happened?" She looked at the papers for a moment, then, "What do you know about my accident?" "That you were in one. That you've been recovering. That's essentially it." She seemed to consider this. "They told you I was in a car accident." "They implied it." "There was a car accident," she said, 18 months ago. Daniel was driving. There was another car involved, a driver named Marcus Webb who had been drinking. She kept her voice even, the way people keep their voices even when the content underneath is the opposite of even. "Mr. Webb died at the scene." "I'm sorry." "The official report says the accident was Mr. Webb's fault. Impaired driver crossed the center line." A pause. "That's not exactly what happened." The study was quiet around them. Outside, the evening light was going gray. "What happened?" he said. She looked up at him, those dark eyes measuring something. Daniel had been drinking too, not as much as Webb, but enough. The family's lawyers spent 3 weeks making sure that part didn't appear in the final record. He absorbed this. And you were in the car with him. I was in the car with him. Her hands were on the papers, pressing them flat against the desk in the way she pressed things when the feeling got close. I knew he'd been drinking. I told him I'd call a car. He said he was fine. A breath. He was not fine. Did you tell anyone what actually happened? I was in the hospital for 6 weeks after the accident. By the time I was conscious enough to understand what had been done to the record, she stopped. Reset. My father came to my room and explained that the family had handled it, that Marcus Webb's family had been compensated, that the matter was closed. Compensated. Money, she said, with a particular edge on the word. The Lennox family's solution to almost everything is money. He thought about the 37 pages he'd signed. Yeah, he said, I've noticed. Something shifted in her face at that. Not quite a smile, but its precursor, the ghost of one. I didn't speak after that, she said. Not for a long time. They called it trauma response, psychological sequelae of the injury. The neurologist had a long name for it. She looked down at her hands on the papers. I think I just decided that if the only words that mattered were the ones I wasn't allowed to say, I wasn't going to say any of them. The quiet stretched out between them. He could hear his own breathing. And the paralysis? He said carefully. Real, she said. And also, the doctors have told me there's a component that isn't purely mechanical, that the injury to my spine was significant, but that my recovery has been slower than it should be. She said it without self-pity, which made it heavier somehow. My father prefers the physical explanation. It's cleaner. But I think the body knows when it's been asked to carry something it shouldn't have to carry alone. He stood in the doorway of that study and looked at this woman who had spent 14 months in a wheelchair in a glass room full of plants, not speaking, not performing, and he understood something that hadn't been in any of the briefings. She wasn't broken. She was refusing. There was a difference, and it was enormous. Why are you reading his documents now? He said. She looked back at the papers. Because your son is going to come home soon, she said, and I've been thinking about what I want this house to be when he does. He didn't fully understand that answer, but he let it sit. Okay, he said. The main study, she said. Second drawer. He went and found the household schedule. Noah came home on a Wednesday, 18 days after the surgery. Home. Ethan was still adjusting to that word. He'd arranged Noah's room on the second floor, across the hall from his own, close enough that he could hear if anything happened in the night, with the stuffed animals and the drawing tablet and the books. And he'd put a small lamp on the desk that Noah could leave on if he needed it, because Noah had gone through a phase of not wanting to be in the dark, and Ethan wasn't sure if that phase was over. Dora had put fresh flowers on the windowsill, which Ethan hadn't asked her to do and was grateful for. He drove to the hospital alone and came back with Noah in the passenger seat. Noah's seat reclined slightly because the incision was still uncomfortable, Noah wearing the oversized sweatshirt he'd requested specifically because it was soft. He fell asleep before they'd gotten off the hospital's block. Ethan drove carefully, more carefully than he normally did, aware of every bump and break in a way he hadn't been since Noah was a newborn, and he'd driven home from the hospital at 35 miles an hour, with Vanessa sitting in the back seat next to the infant carrier, both of them barely breathing. He parked in the estate's side lot and sat for a second looking at the stone building while Noah slept beside him. Then Noah opened his eyes, the way he always did. Not groggy, just suddenly present, like sleep was a switch. He looked at the building through the windshield. It's bigger than I drew it, he said. I told you. I still got some things right. He sat up carefully, wincing, but dismissing the wince before Ethan could say anything about it. Is the garden in the back? Yeah? Okay. He unbuckled his seatbelt with the particular deliberateness of someone managing pain without wanting to make it a production. I want to see it. Not now. Tomorrow, maybe. Tomorrow, Ethan agreed. He helped Noah out of the car and through the entrance, and Dora met them in the foyer with a quiet efficiency that somehow communicated both welcome and the understanding that nobody needed a fuss made. She showed Noah his room, which Noah examined with serious attention, going to the window, checking the desk, identifying the lamp. And Noah said, "The flowers are good," with the evaluative tone of someone making a formal assessment. "They're from Dora," Ethan said. Noah looked at her. "Thank you." Dora said, "Of course," with a warmth that Ethan hadn't heard from her before, and he realized that Noah had probably gotten further with her in 40 seconds than he had in a month. The meeting with Sophia happened the next afternoon. It wasn't arranged. Ethan hadn't set it up or prepared Noah for it beyond the basics, because he didn't know how to prepare a 7-year-old for a woman who mostly didn't speak and was working through something that didn't have a clean name. He'd told Noah she was private, that she'd been through something hard, that you didn't need to fill silence just because it was there. Noah had said, "I know," in the tone he used when adults told him things he'd already figured out. It happened in the conservatory. Ethan had brought Noah there in the mid-afternoon to show him the garden through the glass, because Noah had specifically requested to see it before going outside. Something about wanting the full picture first. They came through the door and through the plants, and Sophia was in her usual place by the far panel, except that she'd turned her chair slightly, which she'd started doing more lately, a degree or two away from the straight window-facing position. She saw them when they were halfway through the room. Her face did a thing Ethan had learned to watch for, the slight tensing, the reassembling of the controlled surface, but underneath it something else moved that he hadn't quite seen before. Noah looked at her. She looked at Noah. Noah said, "Hi, I'm Noah. My dad says you like the garden." A silence. Ethan held himself very still. "I do," Sophia said. Noah seemed satisfied with this. He turned to look out the glass at the garden below. The stone path, the bare fountain, the careful planting that someone maintained with evident care. He studied it for a long time with the focused attention he brought to things he'd been anticipating. "The fountain's not running," he said. "No," she said. "It hasn't been." "How come?" A pause. "It broke. About a year ago." Noah nodded. He kept looking at the garden. "I drew it wrong," he said. "I had the path going the other way." He didn't seem particularly bothered by this. "I got the fountain right, though. The shape." Ethan looked at Sophia. She was looking at Noah with an expression he'd never seen on her before, not the dark, measured wariness she used for most things. Something more open, more uncertain, like she didn't know what to do with it and wasn't sure she minded not knowing. "You drew the fountain?" she said. "I drew the whole garden," Noah said, matter-of-factly, "before I saw it, to see if I was paying attention to the right things." He turned from the window and looked at her directly, with the unselfconsciousness of a child who hadn't yet learned that looking at someone was an act that required permission. "I made a better one. It's a present, for when I'm better enough to walk around and see everything properly." He considered her chair with the same direct attention. "We can go look at it together. When I can walk better, and you can too." The conservatory was very quiet. Outside, the garden sat still in the afternoon light. Sophia's jaw worked slightly. Something in her face was doing something that Ethan didn't want to name or look at too directly, because it felt like the kind of thing that broke if you shone a light on it too fast. "All right," she said. Her voice was low and slightly uneven. "Okay," Noah said easily, already turning back to study the garden with his cataloging eye. "I think the fountain would look better with the water going up higher, like a real one. Is it expensive to fix?" "Probably not," Sophia said, and her voice had steadied. "Then you should fix it," he said with 7-year-old logic. "It would be better." Something changed after that afternoon. It wasn't dramatic and it wasn't clean, and Ethan noticed it mostly in accumulation. Small things that were different from the week before. Sophia began appearing at meals. Not every meal, and not at the formal dining table, but in the kitchen sometimes. At the end where she'd positioned herself that night at 2 a.m. She and Noah developed a quiet, oddly matched rhythm of coexistence. Noah would draw at the kitchen table while she read or worked on her documents, and neither of them required the other to perform anything, which seemed to suit them both. Noah showed her his drawings one piece at a time with the seriousness of a curator. She looked at each one properly, which he noticed and appreciated. She asked questions that were specific, about why he'd chosen a particular color, about what the in-between places were, about the people in the windows of the houses, and Noah answered them with the same specificity, pleased to be taken seriously. Ethan watched this from the edges, making coffee and managing Noah's medication schedule and doing his freelance work at the other end of the table, and felt something that was complicated and warm and that he was careful not to examine too closely. He had other things to be careful about. It was Margaret Hale who reminded him of this, arriving at the estate on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Noah came home, unannounced in the way that people with authority over a situation often were. She came through the front door and found Ethan in the hallway and said, with the clipped precision he remembered from the first phone call, that she needed to speak with him privately. They went to the formal sitting room. She sat across from him with her hands folded and looked at him with the expression of someone about to deliver information they'd been authorized to deliver, and no more. "The family is pleased the arrangement is proceeding," she said. "Good. However, there's some concern." She paused. "About the nature of your relationship with Sophia." He kept his face neutral. "What about it?" "The contract specifies a functional arrangement, social, legal, caregiving. It does not anticipate a personal dynamic." "We talk," Ethan said. She started talking. "I thought that was the point." "Within appropriate parameters." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the family has concerns about Sophia's emotional stability and about the influence of outside perspectives on her current state." He understood then what she was actually saying. It settled into him with a particular coldness. "You're worried I'm getting her to talk about things the family doesn't want her talking about." A very small pause. "I'm conveying the family's concern about Sophia's well-being." "Is that what you're doing?" "Mr. Cole, she's been in that conservatory for 14 months not speaking," he said. His voice came out level, which cost something. "She started talking. She's eating at a table sometimes. She's spending time with my son. If that's outside appropriate parameters, I'm not sure what you came here wanting from me." Margaret Hale looked at him with the composure of someone who had anticipated this response. "The family simply wants to ensure that Sophia's communications remain considered. You want her to stay quiet. We want her to be well." "Right." He stood up. "Is there anything else?" She studied him for a moment, assessing, recalibrating. Whatever she concluded, she kept it behind that composed surface. "Just the reminder," she said, "of the terms." After she left, Ethan stood in the empty sitting room and thought about 37 pages and the pen in his shaking hand and the foam airplane sticker on the back of Noah's hand. He thought about the trade he'd made and whether the terms were what he'd understood them to be. Then he went and found Sophia in the conservatory. She was in her spot by the window. She heard him come in and turned her head. He said, "Margaret Hale was here." Her face didn't change, but her hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "What did she say?" "She said the family has concerns about us talking." A silence. Something moved in her eyes. Not surprise. More like confirmation of something she'd already expected. "They know I've been reading Daniel's documents," she said. "What's in them?" She looked out at the garden for a long moment. The fountain that wasn't running. The path that went the other way from how Noah had drawn it. "Enough," she said. "Enough to make what they buried very difficult to keep buried." He sat down on the low bench near her chair, the one the nurses used, the one that put him roughly at eye level with her rather than standing over. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. The afternoon light came through the glass and hit the side of her face and made her look for a moment, like something that had been under pressure for a very long time and was deciding right now whether to hold or to give. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I've been thinking that I'm tired of carrying things that aren't mine to carry." He held her gaze. "Then don't." "It's not simple." "No, but you know what the right thing is." She looked at him for a long time. "You don't know what it will cost." "I know what it costs to do nothing," he said. "That's the one I've seen up close." The conservatory held them in its warm green quiet. Outside, the afternoon was going toward evening, the light shifting from flat to gold, and somewhere in the house, Noah was drawing something he hadn't seen yet, getting the shape of things right before he went out to check. Sophia turned back to the window, but her hands, he noticed, had released the arms of the chair. And that night, there was a message on his phone from the S in his contacts, sent at 11:43, that said only, "I've decided." He stared at it for a long time in the dark of his room. Then he typed, "Okay, I'm here," and meant it. She'd decided, but deciding and doing were two different countries with a long road between them. Ethan understood this the morning after the text message, when he came down to find Sophia already at the kitchen table with coffee she'd made herself, which was new, the self-made coffee. A detail that mattered in the same way all the small details had been mattering, and a legal pad in front of her covered in handwriting that she turned face down when he came in. Not hiding it, just not ready. He didn't ask. He made his own coffee and sat at the side of the table, the position he'd settled into over the past weeks, and looked at his phone while she looked at her legal pad through its blank reverse side, and they shared the kitchen in the way they'd gotten used to sharing spaces. Parallel, present, not requiring anything from each other before the day had properly started. Noah came down at 7:30, moving carefully the way he still did, one hand on the wall going down the stairs, his incision site still tender enough that he'd unconsciously adjusted his whole gait to protect it. He sat down across from Sophia and said "morning" to both of them without differentiation, like they were just two people who lived in the same house, which Ethan supposed was accurate enough. "I finished the garden drawing," Noah said to Sophia. She looked at him. "The corrected version?" "Yeah, with the path going the right way." He had the tablet under his arm, tucked carefully. "I want to wait until we go outside together to give it to you, so you can check it against the real one." Sophia looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "It might be next week," Noah said. "My doctor said maybe next week I can go outside for a little while." He said this with the practical patience of someone who'd been told a lot of maybe next weeks and had learned to hold them lightly. "Next week," Sophia said, like she was marking it somewhere. Noah poured himself cereal with the methodical focus he brought to tasks that required care, and Ethan watched Sophia watch him and thought about what she'd said in the conservatory, about what she wanted the house to be when Noah came home. He was beginning to understand what she'd meant. Not a Lennox estate, not a contractual arrangement, something that had furniture from real use and coffee from being awake, and a kid who said morning without making it an event. She was building something in her head. He just hoped she'd get the chance to build it in real life before the Lennox family closed the road. She called a lawyer that afternoon. Not the family's lawyers, her own, someone she'd clearly identified before now, which told Ethan this decision hadn't been made in a single night. She made the call from the small study at the end of the east wing, with the door closed, and Ethan only knew about it because Dora mentioned it in passing, in the careful way Dora mentioned things she thought he should know but wasn't going to editorialize on. He waited until evening, until Noah was in his room drawing and the house was in its quiet mode, and knocked on the conservatory door. She was there, legal pad on her lap now, pen in hand, working. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked up. "What?" "From me. Practically. Whatever you're doing, tell me what you need." She put the pen down on the legal pad and looked at him with the assessing directness he'd gotten used to, measuring what he meant by the offer, whether there were terms. "My lawyer needs documentation," she said. "Physical records from the accident. The family's legal team moved most of it off-site after the settlement, but there are copies in the estate's records room. Basement level." She paused. "I'm not supposed to access those files." "Who decides that?" "The estate manager, who answers to my father." "Not to you." "I'm the one in the wheelchair who doesn't speak," she said, with a flat, dry precision that wasn't self-pity, but something sharper. "Or I was. The household operating structure hasn't caught up with the revision." He thought about the basement level. He'd been down there once, early on, looking for something Dora had directed him toward. He remembered a corridor of rooms, some locked, some not. "What does the documentation look like? What am I looking for?" She wrote something on the legal pad, tore the page off, and held it out to him. He took it. Her handwriting was precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who'd been trained toward neatness and had their own tendencies pulling against it. File numbers, dates, a description of what each document should contain. There's a room at the end of the basement corridor, she said. Gray door, combination lock. My father's birthday, backwards. You know the combination. I've known it for years. He uses it for everything. A pause. He's never considered that I'd use it. Ethan looked at the page. When? Tonight. The house staff rotates off at 10. He nodded, folded the paper into his pocket. Okay. She watched him put the paper away. You understand that if my father finds out, I know. The contract. I know what the contract says. She stopped. He could see her recalibrating, the way she did when he didn't respond the way she'd anticipated. Why? She said. You have what you needed. Noah's surgery is done. You could finish the 2 years, take the settlement, and walk away from all of this. Yeah, he said. So why? Because you were carrying something that wasn't yours to carry, he said. And I told you not to. He let that sit for a second. Can't really say that and then step back when it gets inconvenient. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the evening was full dark, the garden invisible beyond the glass. He could see their faint reflections in the conservatory panels. Her in the chair, him standing, both of them in this warm, plant-filled room at the edge of something that was going to change things. The gray door, she said. Don't use a flashlight if you can avoid it. There's a motion sensor in the corridor that's connected to a separate system from the main house. Okay. Ethan. She used his name so rarely that it still registered when she did, a small recalibration each time. Be careful. He went to find the gray door. Chess. The basement was colder than the rest of the house and smelled like climate-controlled air and paper. He went down at 10:15 when the house was quiet and the staff rotation had completed, and he moved through the corridor with his phone screen dimmed and his eyes adjusted to the low emergency lighting. The gray door was where she'd said. The combination opened on the first try. Her father's birthday, reversed, 7 digits entered on a keypad that clicked with each press. The door swung open on a room that was smaller than he'd expected, lined with filing cabinets and archive boxes, a small desk with a lamp that he risked turning on because the room had no windows. He worked from the list. File numbers first, matching them to the labels on the cabinet drawers. The accident report was in the 3rd drawer he opened. A thick folder, tabbed and organized in the meticulous way of legal documents prepared by people who charged by the hour. He found the original police report, the witness statements, the medical assessments, and then, behind those, in a separate folder with a different firm's header, the internal correspondence. He didn't read it all. He read enough. The emails between the Lennox family's legal team and the investigating officer were dated in the 3 weeks after the accident. They were professionally worded. They were also unambiguous in what they were doing, which was making sure that Daniel Lennox's blood alcohol content at the time of the accident, documented in the hospital records Ethan was also looking at, did not appear in the final accident report filed with the county. Marcus Webb's family had received a settlement of $800,000, paid through a trust that had no visible connection to the Lennox name, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement that had been presented to them while they were still in the acute stage of grief. Ethan stood in that basement room with those papers in his hands and felt a very specific kind of anger. Not hot, not explosive. The cold, settled kind. The kind that understood exactly what it was looking at and was not surprised and was furious anyway. He photographed everything with his phone, replaced it all exactly as he'd found it, cabinet by cabinet. Turned off the desk lamp. Pulled the gray door shut behind him and heard the lock re-engage. Walked back up through the cold corridor and the dark house to where Sophia was waiting. She went through the photographs on his phone methodically, enlarged on screen, her face doing the same contained thing it always did when the content was significant. He sat across from her in the study and let her work through it without interrupting. When she put the phone down, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. That's enough, she said. To do what you want to do? To do what needs to be done. She looked up at him. Something in her face had clarified. Not lightened, not relieved, but clarified. The way a sky clarifies after pressure systems move through. Marcus Webb had a daughter. She was 11 when he died. She's 13 now. She said this like she'd been keeping it, carrying it. I want to know that she has the full truth, not just the money. Your family will fight it. Yes. Not a question. Not hesitation. Just, yes, they will. It'll cost you. Everything has already cost me something, she said. I'm tired of paying for things I didn't buy. He nodded. What's next? My lawyer files a motion on Monday, formally requesting access to the original investigative materials. The family will be notified and they'll respond, probably by Tuesday. She picked up her pen. My father will come here. Let him. She looked at him across the desk. You don't know my father. No, but I've met Margaret Hale and I've signed 37 pages of his family's paperwork, so I've got a working sense of how he operates. He leaned forward. Do you want me in the room when he comes? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I think I do. Richard Lennox arrived on Wednesday afternoon. He was 64 years old and carried himself in the way of men who'd spent decades in rooms where their arrival mattered, which was to say, he moved through space like it owed him something. He was silver-haired, composed, and had the particular kind of handsomeness that came from never having been short of anything. Ethan had been told he was coming via a text from Margaret at 11 that morning. He told Noah there was going to be a meeting, and Noah, who had learned the shape of adult difficulties, had said okay and taken his tablet to his room without being asked. Ethan was in the front hall when Richard Lennox came through the door. They looked at each other for a moment with the mutual assessment of people who'd heard about each other and were now calibrating the distance between that and the reality. Mr. Cole, Richard said. He didn't extend a hand. Mr. Lennox. Richard moved past him into the formal sitting room with the ease of a man walking into his own house, which it technically was. He sat without being invited. Ethan sat across from him. Where's Sophia? Richard said. She'll be here in a minute. Richard looked around the room. His eyes moved to the doorway down the hall with the reading quality of someone cataloging information. I understand she's been more active lately. She has. I understand you've been involved in that. We live in the same house, Ethan said. It'd be hard not to be involved. Richard looked at him with the patience of someone who had a very large hand and was deciding when to show it. The arrangement was for companionship and care, Mr. Cole, not for encouragement in certain directions. She started talking, Ethan said. I thought that was a good thing. It's a complicated thing. Only if there are things you don't want said. The air in the room shifted. Richard's composure didn't crack. It was too practiced for that. But it compressed, tightened around the edges. He looked at Ethan with a new quality of attention, the kind you give something you've decided is a problem. Then the door from the corridor opened and Sophia came in. She wheeled herself to a position that wasn't beside Ethan and wasn't across from her father, but somewhere that placed her at a point of her own. A slight physical assertion of independence in a room that her father had been trying to reorganize in his favor from the moment he walked in. She looked at him without any of the expressions a daughter might produce for a father. Just direct. Level. The same eyes she'd turned on Ethan that first night, measuring, contained, not willing to perform. Richard, she said. Not dad, not father, just the name. He absorbed this. Sophia, you look well. I look the same. Your lawyer has filed a motion. Yes. I'd like to understand what you think you're accomplishing. She held his gaze. I think I'm accomplishing the truth. Richard leaned forward slightly. The truth, he repeated, in the tone of someone who found the word imprecise. The truth is that a man who had been drinking crossed a center line and caused an accident that injured you and killed him. That's the truth. Part of it, Sophia said. The part that matters legally. The part that was made to matter legally, she said. There's a difference. Sophia. His voice shifted, not louder, but denser. The voice used on people who were expected to fold. Do you understand what you'll be doing to the family, to Daniel? Daniel made a choice, she said. He drove when he shouldn't have. A man died. His daughter grew up without a father. She kept her voice level with a visible effort. The family made a choice to bury that. I was in a hospital bed and I couldn't stop it. I'm not in a hospital bed now. You're in a wheelchair, Richard said. and the words landed like something calculated. The room went quiet. Ethan felt his jaw tighten and stayed still, because this wasn't his moment to move. Sophia looked at her father. Her hands were on the arms of the chair, not gripping them, which was different from before. Just resting, like she'd stopped needing to hold on. "Yes," she said. "I am. And I've had 14 months to think about everything that put me here, including the part where you sat beside my hospital bed and told me the matter was handled and expected me to be grateful." She let that land. "I'm not grateful. I've been waiting to be ready to say so." Richard Lennox looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan with the expression of someone assigning blame for a situation to the nearest available target. "I assume you've had a hand in this," he said. "She found her own way to this," Ethan said. "I just didn't stand in front of it." "The contract? I've read the contract," Ethan said. "All 37 pages. It says I provide companionship and care. It doesn't say I keep her quiet." Richard stood. He was tall, and he used height the way powerful men often did, as a passive form of pressure. He looked down at both of them, and Ethan saw in his face the calculation. What he could do, what it would cost, what his options were. He saw the man run through them and reach a conclusion. "You'll lose the settlement," he said to Ethan. "If you're in breach of the spirit of the agreement, keep it," Ethan said. That stopped Richard. He hadn't expected it. Ethan could see that. "Keep the settlement," Ethan said again. "I don't want it." A silence. Then Richard turned to Sophia. "You'll lose the trust, the properties, everything structured under family control." "I know," she said. Daniel has to answer for what he did," she said. "You can't keep carrying it for him. And I can't keep pretending you didn't try to make me carry it too." Richard Lennox stood in the formal sitting room of his estate and looked at his daughter, and for just a second, beneath all the composure and the calculation, Ethan saw something move. Not regret exactly, but the shadow of it. The awareness of a road not taken, long ago, that had led to exactly this room. Then it was gone. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair and said, "My lawyers will be in touch," and walked out. The front door closed behind him with a sound that was heavy and final, and somehow also like the first breath of a room that had been airless for a long time. The next 2 weeks were noise, legal noise, motions and counter-motions, and phone calls that Sophia took in the study with her lawyer on speaker, her voice steady and technical, and nothing like the silence that had occupied this house for over a year. Ethan sat in on 2 of them when she asked him to, and sat outside the door on the others, because she needed to know someone was there without needing them inside. Family noise? Daniel called once on a Thursday evening, and Sophia took it in her room with the door closed. Ethan heard nothing of the conversation. Afterward, she came to the kitchen and sat at the end of the table for a long time without speaking, and he made tea because it gave him something to do with his hands. And eventually she said, "He knew I'd do this eventually. He said he's been waiting for it." She wrapped her hands around the mug. He sounded relieved. Ethan didn't know what to do with that information. "How do you feel about it?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the tea. "He's my brother. That doesn't change what he did. Both things are true simultaneously, and I don't have a way to make them into one thing." "You don't have to," he said. She looked at him. "People want you to make it into one thing." "People are uncomfortable with complicated," he said. "That's their problem." She held his gaze for a moment, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and somewhere upstairs Noah was asleep in his room with the lamp on. There was also the noise from Noah's follow-up appointments, which told them, by the 3rd week, that his recovery was proceeding the way Dr. Ellison had hoped. Not perfectly. He had a period of elevated heart rate that required an adjustment to his medication, and 2 nights where he woke at 3 in the morning and came to find Ethan, which Ethan was both worried about and glad for, because being needed at 3 in the morning was something he could actually do. But the arc was right. It was going the right direction. And on a Saturday, 3 weeks after Noah had come home, he declared himself well enough for the garden. He came downstairs in the morning in his coat and said, "Today," with the finality of someone making an executive decision, and Ethan looked at him and then looked at Sophia, who was in the kitchen, and Sophia looked at Noah and said, "Give me 5 minutes." She came back in her chair with her coat on too, a dark green one he hadn't seen before, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision separate from the garden, separate from the drawing, something that had been building for weeks, and had found this moment to step out into. They went through the back corridor and out the estate's rear door. The garden was cold and still in the November morning, the kind of clear cold that made everything look like it had been cleaned overnight. The stone path ran ahead of them, and the dry fountain sat at its center, and the bare branches of the trees along the wall made their particular pattern against the gray sky. Noah walked carefully, one hand occasionally finding Ethan's arm for balance without making it a statement. He had the drawing under his other arm in a protective plastic sleeve. They went slowly. That was fine. None of them were in a hurry. At the fountain, Noah stopped and looked at it for a long time with his comparison face on, the face he made when checking reality against the version in his head. "I got the basin right," he said. "The rim is a little thicker than I drew it." "It's an old fountain," Sophia said from beside him. She'd positioned her chair near the edge of the path where the stone was level. "It was here when the house was built." Noah looked at her. "How old?" "About 80 years?" "Well, that's older than anything I've ever touched," he said with genuine interest, and put his hand on the stone rim of the fountain, just resting it there for a second, like he was feeling 80 years through his palm. Then he pulled the drawing from the sleeve and held it out to Sophia. She took it, held it with both hands, looking at it, then looking up at the garden, checking it. His version versus the real one. The path corrected. The fountain centered. The trees along the wall thinner than he'd made them, the house in the background slightly less symmetrical. He'd drawn two figures in the garden, a boy walking, a woman in a chair, both of them facing the fountain. Sophia looked at the two figures for a long moment. "You're in it," she said, looking at the boy. "We both are," Noah said simply. She looked up at him. Then she looked at Ethan, who was standing back a step, and her face did the thing it had been doing more lately. Not quite emotion, too complicated for just one name. She turned back to the drawing, and Ethan saw her swallow once. "Thank you, Noah," she said. Her voice was steady. "You can hang it somewhere if you want," he offered. "Or not. It's just to keep." "I'll hang it," she said. "In the conservatory." Noah nodded, satisfied, and turned back to study the fountain with his cataloging attention. "You should really fix this," he said. "I looked it up online. You can get people to restore old fountains. It's not that complicated." "You looked it up," Ethan said. "Yeah, while I was in bed recovering." He said this with the matter-of-fact energy of someone who'd used their recovery time productively. "I can send you the links if you want," he said to Sophia. She looked at this 7-year-old who had researched fountain restoration from a hospital bed as a gift to a woman he barely knew, and something in her face shifted. Genuinely this time, past the composed surface, a crack in the careful architecture that let something real come through. "Yes," she said. "Send me the links." Noah pulled out his tablet and started typing with the one-finger efficiency of a kid who'd grown up touching screens. Sophia watched him, and Ethan watched Sophia, and the garden was cold and clear around all three of them, and the fountain sat dry and old at its center, and the morning went on without asking anything from any of them except to be in it. He would think about this moment later, much later, as one of the ones that had mattered without announcing itself. Just 3 people in a garden on a cold Saturday, standing and sitting and moving at different speeds, all of them recovering from something, none of them pretending they weren't. That was the day the house stopped feeling borrowed. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Ethan hadn't fully understood when Sophia said, "I've decided," how much machinery would need to move to honor that decision. There were depositions and counterfilings, and a period in late December when Richard Lennox's legal team attempted to have Sophia declared mentally unfit to pursue the case. A move so nakedly designed to silence her that even the judge presiding over the preliminary hearing noted it with visible distaste. That hearing lasted 2 hours. Sophia sat in the witness area in her wheelchair and answered every question from her father's lawyers with the particular composure of someone who had spent 14 months preparing to not be undone by the thing trying to undo her. Ethan sat in the gallery for that hearing. He'd offered to stay home. It was her proceeding, her family, her truth to tell. And she'd said, in the tone she used for things she'd decided, "Come." So he'd come. He sat behind the bar and watched her field questions designed to make her seem unstable, fragile, confused, emotionally compromised by her accident and her isolation, and whatever they could assemble into a picture of a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own testimony. She answered in sentences that were precise and complete, and occasionally so direct that the questioning attorney had to pause and recalibrate. At one point, the attorney asked if she could explain why. After 14 months of what her own medical records described as selective mutism, she had suddenly recovered the ability to testify. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't suddenly recover anything. I chose to stop being silent about a specific set of things. Those aren't the same." Ethan looked at his hands in his lap, looked up at the ceiling, did everything he could to keep his face neutral in the gallery. The mental competency challenge was dismissed before Christmas. Daniel's testimony came in January, which no one had predicted, including Sophia. He'd contacted her lawyer voluntarily. Not a dramatic conversion, not a tearful confession, but a quiet, tired communication from a 43-year-old man who had, according to Sophia, spent 2 years carrying something that had made him smaller every day he carried it. He testified to what had actually happened that night, how much he'd had to drink, the argument with Sophia before he'd gotten in the car, the moment he'd understood after impact that the other car was badly damaged and that someone was badly hurt and that he had been a reason for it. He testified without looking at his father, who was present. Sophia watched her brother from across the courtroom with an expression Ethan couldn't fully read. Not forgiveness. That would be too clean, too fast, too much the resolution that stories were supposed to deliver. More like recognition. The acknowledgement of someone finally being the person you'd always wanted them to be, 20 months too late, and also better than never. After the session, she sat in the courthouse corridor while Ethan brought her coffee from a machine that dispensed something that barely deserved the name, and she held the paper cup and stared at the middle distance for a while. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like something that's been wound very tight, just lost a few turns," she said. "Not all of them, just a few." "That's something." "It is." She looked at the coffee. He was crying. "Did you see that?" "Yeah." "Daniel doesn't cry. He wasn't raised for it." She turned the cup in her hands. "I haven't seen him cry since we were children." Ethan didn't say anything. He sat beside her on the hard courthouse bench and let the silence do what it needed to do. "I'm not ready to forgive him," she said. "You don't have to be. People will expect it. After this, the full resolution." Her voice was dry but not bitter. "People can manage their own expectations," he said. "You don't owe anyone a timeline on that." She looked at him sideways. "You say things like they're obvious, like the hard version is just the obvious one and everyone else is making it complicated. Isn't it?" "No," she said. "It really isn't, for most people." He thought about that. "Maybe I had a lot of time to figure out what I could and couldn't afford to be complicated about," he said. "When you're broke and your kid is sick, you stop spending energy on a lot of things." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you stop spending it on?" "Caring what people thought about my choices. Waiting to feel ready before I did what needed doing. Pretending things were fine when they weren't." He picked up his own paper cup. "Mostly the last one. That one took the most energy and did the least good." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes. "That's actually the hard version," she said. "Most people do the opposite." "I know, I did the opposite for years first. It just got expensive." The courthouse corridor was the particular institutional beige of places that handled difficult things daily and had given up on aesthetics. People moved through it around them, lawyers and clerks and people in various stages of whatever had brought them here. And Ethan and Sophia sat on the bench with their bad coffee and occupied their small patch of it and were, without either of them having planned it, exactly where they were supposed to be. The formal settlement came in February. Marcus Webb's daughter, her name was Kara, she was 13 and lived with her mother in a small house in Claremont, received a full acknowledgement of the circumstances of her father's death, a formal statement of what had actually happened from the Lennox family's own legal representatives, and a revised settlement that her mother's attorney had negotiated to reflect the full truth of the situation. Ethan didn't know the number and didn't ask. He knew it was more than $800,000 and that it had come with something the first payment hadn't, the actual facts. Sophia had requested that the acknowledgement be sent as a letter, directly from her to Kara's mother. She'd written it herself, not through lawyers, at the desk in the East Wing study over the course of 3 evenings. Ethan had seen the legal pad going through iterations, pages folded back, lines crossed out, whole sections restarted. She hadn't shown him the final version. He hadn't asked to see it. What she did tell him, the evening after it was sent, was this: "I told her I was sorry it took this long. I told her that her daughter's father deserved to be remembered as someone whose death mattered enough to tell the truth about." She stopped. "I don't know if it helps, probably nothing helps. But I didn't want to just send money and a legal summary." "It helps," Ethan said. "Not to fix it, but it helps." She nodded slowly. She believed him, or wanted to, which was close enough. The consequences for the Lennox family were significant and not immediate. Legal accountability moved at its own pace, and Richard Lennox had resources that cushioned impact in ways unavailable to ordinary people. But the original investigating officer faced a formal inquiry. The county prosecutor's office opened a review. The law firm that had managed the cover-up quietly announced that 2 senior partners were stepping back from active practice while the matter was assessed. Richard Lennox called Sophia once during this period. She took the call in her room with the door open this time, which Ethan understood as a choice, and he heard only her side of it from the corridor. Brief answers, no raised voice, nothing that indicated she was being moved from the place she'd found. When the call ended, she came out and said simply, "He wants the estate returned to family management at the end of the contract." "That's 7 months away," Ethan said. "I know." She looked down the corridor toward the conservatory. "I've been thinking about that." "About the estate?" "About after," she said. "What comes after?" He was quiet. He'd been thinking about after too, with a kind of sideways awareness that he hadn't let himself look at directly, because it had too many parts that he wasn't sure how to handle. "We have time," he said. 7 months isn't much. "It's enough to figure out what we actually want," he said, "which is what we should have been doing anyway." She looked at him with the slight tilt of her head that meant she was disagreeing about something, but considering whether it was worth the argument. "You make it sound like we haven't been doing that." "I think we've been doing it," he said. "I just don't think we've been calling it what it is." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and went to the conservatory, and he stood in the corridor and decided to let that one sit where he'd put it, and went to check on Noah. The physical changes in Sophia came slowly, then less slowly, then in increments that were impossible to ignore. Her neurologist had been saying for months that the plateau in her recovery had a component they hadn't been able to unlock, that the spinal injury, while real and significant, left more potential for movement than she'd been accessing. He'd been careful about it, qualified it with everything he had to qualify it with, because hope was a weight a doctor could put on a patient that could crush them if it didn't come true. But in late January, during a physical therapy session that Ethan was not present for, but heard about from both Sophia and the therapist in the same evening, she'd stood. Not for long, not without support. But her legs had taken weight, the right one more than the left, for a period of time that the therapist measured precisely because measurement mattered in that work. And Sophia had stood and looked at the room from that height, and then asked to sit back down and not made it a production. She told Ethan about it that evening in the kitchen, in the flat tone she used for significant things she wasn't ready to be emotional about. "I stood up today," she said. He put down what he was doing. "How long?" "About 40 seconds on the right leg, shorter on the left." "That's—" He stopped himself from saying the wrong thing, from making it more than she'd already made it, because she was watching him carefully, and he understood he was being trusted with the information, and that trust came with a responsibility not to overwhelm it. "That's good." "It hurt," she said. "My legs aren't... Things have atrophied. There's a lot of work between 40 seconds and walking." She was looking at the table. "I don't want anyone to make it into something, into some kind of moment." "Okay. I mean anyone in this house. I'll tell Noah." She looked up. Something moved in her face. "Don't tell him yet. I don't want him to watch for it. He watches things too carefully." "He does. Ethan agreed. It's a lot. It is. But she said it with the particular softness she reserved for Noah specifically, the softness she'd developed somewhere around the fountain drawing and had never quite put back down. He's doing well. His last appointment was good. Dr. Reyes said another month, and she's probably looking at downgrading the monitoring schedule. He told me, she said. He also told me he wants to learn to play chess. He wants to play chess. He asked if I knew how. A pause. I do know how. My grandfather taught me. She looked at her hands on the table. I told him I'd teach him. Ethan looked at this woman at the end of his kitchen table, or her kitchen table, or whatever the table was, and thought about the night he'd first come to this house, about the woman in the wheelchair who hadn't looked at him, who had turned her face away from the room like she'd already decided she wasn't going to fully arrive. He thought about the foam airplane sticker on Noah's hand and the 37 pages he'd signed without reading and the water stain on his old apartment ceiling. He thought about all the distances traveled to get to this kitchen at this hour. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked at him. When the contract ends, he stopped, started differently. I don't want to leave because a contract ended. I want to know if that's something you... He stopped again because the words kept coming out wrong, too formal or too insufficient, neither one landing where he meant it to go. She watched him struggle with it without rescuing him, which was very like her. I'm not good at this, he said. I know. I've been not good at it for a while. I know that too. She picked up her mug. Ask what you were going to ask. He looked at her. Do you want us to stay? She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm around them, the particular warmth of a house in winter that had been heated for long enough that the warmth had settled into the walls. Noah asked me something last week, she said. He asked if I thought people could become a family even if they started out as strangers. What did you say? I said I thought the starting point mattered less than what you did after it. He held her gaze. Sophia. Yes, she said. I want you to stay. He nodded. He looked at the table for a second, then back at her. There was more he could say, probably should say, but the kitchen was already full of the weight of it, and he didn't want to add more than it could hold. So he just said, Okay. She reached across the corner of the table, which was a small distance, and put her hand over his, just for a moment. Not a grand gesture, just a hand on a hand in a kitchen, at 9 o'clock at night, both of them imperfect and tired, and still here. Then she picked up her mug, and they sat in the warm quiet and didn't need to say anything else. Noah found out about the standing in a way nobody planned, which was typically how Noah found out things. He came to a physical therapy session. The therapist's clinic was downtown, and Ethan usually drove Sophia on Tuesdays while Noah was at his own follow-up appointments. But this particular Tuesday, the schedules had overlapped awkwardly, and Noah came along and sat in the clinic's waiting area with his tablet and was supposed to stay there. He appeared in the therapy room doorway at the exact moment Sophia was upright, the therapist's hands at her elbows, her legs taking the weight with visible effort, her face set in the particular expression she made when something was costing her. Noah stood in the doorway and looked at her standing and didn't say anything. He didn't shout or cry or make it into an announcement. He just stood there and watched, and when Sophia saw him, she held eye contact with him rather than looking away, which was its own thing. He walked into the room and stood a few feet away and said, with great seriousness, "Your legs work." "A little," she said. Her voice was slightly strained from the effort. "Not much yet, but more than before. More than before." He nodded. He looked at her legs, at the therapist's hands, at the effort involved, and absorbed all of it with the directness that was just how he processed the world. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." "Are you going to keep doing it?" "Yes." "Okay," he said, and went back to the waiting room. Sophia looked at the therapist. "He's going to tell people," the therapist said, amused. "Probably," Sophia said, and she didn't sound as bothered by that as she would have been 3 months ago. A Simchibat. Spring came into the garden in the uneven way that seasons arrived. Not a clean beginning, but patches and advances and retreats. A warm week in March that brought things up, then a cold snap that knocked them back, then a gradual settling into warmth that stayed. The fountain, which a restoration company had come to assess in February and returned to repair in March, ran again in April. It wasn't a dramatic moment. They were all in the house when it was switched on, and Dora came to find them and said simply, "The fountain's running," and they went out to look at it. Noah stood at the rim and watched the water come up and fall and said, "I got the height wrong in the drawing. I made it higher." He seemed more satisfied than disappointed. "It's better this way, though, more like it actually is." The water was cold and clean and caught the spring light in the particular way of water that has been still for a long time and is moving again. Sophia watched it from her chair. She'd been watching the garden differently lately, not out through the glass from the conservatory, but from inside it, up close, where you could hear the birds and the wall trees and feel the air actually moving. She'd been out here more since the therapy had started producing results. Not walking, not yet, not outside where the ground was uneven and the work was harder, but present in it, choosing to be in it rather than watching it through glass. "Noah," she said. He looked at her. "I think it's time we fix the chessboard." He lit up in the specific way he lit up when something he'd been waiting for was finally arriving. "Today?" "After lunch." He turned back to the fountain with renewed satisfaction, like the whole afternoon had just improved. Ethan stood near Sophia's chair and looked at the running water and thought about 7 months ago. The letter on the hallway floor, the $400 bank account, the foam airplane sticker, the cold, long drive to a house full of silence. He thought about 37 pages signed with a shaking hand and told himself he wasn't selling his soul. He'd been wrong about that, as it turned out. Not about the signing, but about what he was trading. He hadn't sold anything. He just had to go very far down before he could see what he actually had and what it was worth. "It sounds different than I thought it would," he said. Sophia looked at the fountain. "What does?" "Running water. Here." He paused, not entirely sure how to finish the thought. "I had this idea of the place from the outside before I came. Something cold and transactional." He looked at the garden, the stone path, the wall trees pushing new green. "It was, for a while." "It was," she agreed. "It isn't now." She was quiet for a moment. The water ran. Noah crouched at the fountain rim and was doing something with his fingers in the water, probably testing temperature with the scientific thoroughness he applied to everything. "He's going to get wet," Ethan said. "Probably," she said, and she was smiling. Actually smiling, not the ghost of one, not the precursor, but the real thing, slightly crooked, slightly reluctant, nothing like a performance. It transformed her face in a way that made her look like someone who'd been smiling her whole life and had just misplaced it for a while. He looked away before she caught him looking, which was a thing he'd been doing more lately and handling with varying degrees of success. The contract's formal end date was the 15th of May. He'd been aware of it approaching the way you're aware of weather, not watching it exactly, but feeling it in the texture of days. Margaret Hale had sent a formal communication in late April outlining the contract's conclusion and the procedures for what she called the transition period. He'd read it once and put it in the drawer of the desk in his room and not opened it again. On the 14th of May, he came home from a grocery run. He'd taken over most of the household grocery shopping in a gradual accretion that no one had formally decided and everyone had just accepted, to find Sophia's car gone from the drive and Dora in the kitchen with a look that told him things were happening. "She went to see her father," Dora said. He set the groceries down on the counter. "She told you?" "She told me to tell you when you got back so you wouldn't assume." "Right." He put the cold things in the refrigerator. "Did she go alone?" "Her lawyer went with her." He absorbed this. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and then went and checked on Noah, who was in his room doing his Tuesday school reading with the focused attention he applied to anything he'd decided to care about. He was fine. He looked up and said, "Sophia went somewhere," and Ethan said, "I know," and Noah went back to his book. She was gone for 3 hours. He was at the kitchen table when she came back, the table she'd sat at that first night when she hadn't been sure if she was staying. She came through from the corridor and he could read from the way she was holding herself. Not tension, not exactly, but something that had been loaded and then discharged, leaving a kind of emptiness that hadn't decided yet what to fill with, that the conversation had been significant and was finished. He waited. She sat at the end of the table. He agreed, she said. To what? To allow me to remain at the estate, in my own name. She looked at the table. I offered him a structured arrangement for the family trusts. It took the lawyer 4 drafts to find language he'd accept, but there's a framework now that doesn't require me to be managed by the family office. A pause. It cost me some things. The properties in Haverfield and the investment accounts under the coal trust, those revert. She looked up. There are things I'm keeping that matter more. He looked at her. Are you okay? I'm okay. She said it in the way she'd learned to say it, not as a deflection but as an actual assessment. She knew the difference between those now, and she'd stopped using one to mean the other. He's still my father. It's still hard to sit in a room with him and feel what I feel. She looked at her hands. He asked about you. What about me? Whether you were staying. A brief pause. I told him yes. He didn't argue. I think he understands that particular battle is done. He's a man who knows when he's won what he can win, Ethan said. Yes. She looked up. He also said, and I'm going to tell you this exactly because I think you should hear it. He said that whatever you are, you're consistent. He said it like a complaint. I think it was actually a concession. Ethan almost smiled. I'll take it. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had started showing him things they'd taken months to show, and he thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides to be in the same room as their own life again. This is what that costs and what it looks like when someone pays it. Noah's birthday is in 3 weeks, he said. I know, he's reminded me 4 times. Something like warmth moved through her expression. He wants a chess tournament. He's already ranked himself above me, which is incorrect, but I've decided to let him find out naturally. Ethan laughed. It came out genuine, the kind that surprised you. He's going to lose badly. Spectacularly, she agreed. And there it was again, that real smile, the crooked, reluctant one, the one that was hers. The physical therapy continued through spring and into early summer. It was slow work, and there were sessions that left Sophia exhausted and frustrated in ways she didn't always hide from Ethan anymore, which was its own form of progress. There were also sessions that produced things, a better range of movement in the left leg, a longer window of weight bearing. A Tuesday in late May, when she took 3 steps between parallel bars with the therapist's hands near but not touching her, and sat back down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment without speaking. The therapist had said gently that she was doing remarkably well given the timeline. Sophia had said, with the dry precision she applied to most things, I had a lot of reasons to not bother, and a few very specific ones to bother, and the specific ones turned out to be stronger. The therapist had nodded like that made all the sense in the world. She told Ethan about the 3 steps in the kitchen that evening, the same way she'd told him about the 40 seconds in January, the flat tone for significant things. He said, 3 steps. Between the bars. With support. That's... He stopped himself again, the same as before, managing the thing he felt into something that didn't overwhelm what she'd offered. 3 more than before. That's the math, she said, and there was a dryness to it, but also something underneath the dryness, something that she was managing the same way he was. Both of them at this kitchen table keeping the feeling in its appropriate container because some feelings were too large for the kitchen and needed to be let out gradually. Noah's birthday was on a Saturday in June, which was a perfect day for it in the way that some days cooperated. Clear, not too hot, the kind of light that came through the conservatory glass and made everything inside it look like it was in a better world. He was 8. He'd been 7 for everything that had happened. For the signing and the hospital and the estate and the frost and the fountain and the chess and the 3 steps. He turned 8 on a Saturday in June with a cake that Dora had made because she'd started baking in ways that the household hadn't seen from her before. And there was a chess tournament that Sophia won in 3 games and Noah lost with great seriousness and no actual distress because he'd learned the losing as well as the strategy and understood both were part of the same thing. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and watched his son and this woman play chess in the June light. Noah's forehead creased with the effort of it, Sophia patient and precise, and occasionally pointing out what he'd missed without making him feel bad for missing it, and he thought, this is the thing. This is the thing right here that you couldn't have told him about when he was sitting on a hallway floor with a letter about $284,000 and no possible road forward. You couldn't have told him that the road went somewhere like this. He wouldn't have believed it, and even if he'd believed it, he wouldn't have understood what it meant. Some things you could only understand from inside them. Later, after the cake, and after Noah had gone to bed, still 8, freshly 8, already planning next year's chess rematch with the strategic seriousness of someone who lost well enough to learn from it, Ethan and Sophia were in the conservatory. The evening light was going gold through the glass and catching the plants in the way that made the room feel like something out of time, and she had her chair near the window but was turned at the angle she used now, the one that kept her partly in the room rather than all the way out of it. He sat on the bench near her, the one at her eye level, the one that said, "I'm here. Not above, not managing, just here." "Thank you for today," he said. "It's his birthday. I didn't do much." "You let him lose to you twice before winning. That cost you something." She looked at him. "It cost me nothing. He needed to see he could get closer. He did get closer." A pause. "He'll beat me within a year. He already thinks in patterns. He just doesn't trust them yet." Ethan looked at her in the evening light. He thought about trust, about how long it took to build, and how specifically it was destroyed, and how the building was never a single large event but always the accumulation of small ones. A cup of coffee set down without ceremony. A window faced or turned from, 2 words spoken after 2 weeks of nothing. A hand over a hand at a kitchen table. 3 steps between parallel bars. A real smile, crooked and reluctant, given to someone who'd decided to be worth the giving. "Sophia," he said. She looked at him. "I signed a contract because my son needed surgery and I was out of options," he said. "That's where this started. I'm not pretending it started somewhere else." He looked at her steadily. "But that's not what this is now." She was quiet. She held his gaze the way she held most things, directly, without flinching from what was in it. "I know what this is," she said. "I want to make sure we've both said it," he said. "Out loud. Not implied. Not in the dark kitchen at 2 a.m. in ways we can walk back." Something moved in her face. "You can't walk back 2 a.m. kitchen conversations. Those count." "I know they count. I want this one to count too." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the garden was in its evening quiet, the fountain running, the light going slow and warm across the stone path. Inside, the plants were doing what they always did, growing, quietly, toward whatever light was available. "I love you," she said. She said it like she said things she'd decided, without hedging, without the performance of uncertainty, just the flat, honest truth of it. "I didn't plan to. I'm not entirely comfortable with it, but I've been sitting with it long enough that I'm fairly sure." He looked at her. He thought about all the ways he'd imagined this conversation going, all the versions he'd run in his head in the months of accumulation, and none of them had been quite like this. Her voice, dry and precise and honest, saying the hard thing the same way she said all the hard things, without dressing it up. He loved her for that particularly. "I love you," he said. "I've been not saying it for a while because the timing kept being wrong." "The timing is still not ideal," she said. "We're in a conservatory on my son-in-law's birthday." "He's not your son-in-law. He's 8. "In a conservatory on the birthday of an 8-year-old who beat me at chess twice before I let him stop getting closer," she corrected. "And the light is doing something very dramatic through that glass panel which feels contrived." He looked at the light. It was in fact doing something dramatic. "We could wait for a more neutral setting." "We've waited long enough for everything," she said. He leaned forward from the bench and she reached toward him at the same moment, which was imperfect and slightly awkward in the way of 2 people who'd spent months being careful not to reach, and were now reaching at the same time without a plan. And when he took her face in both his hands and she put hers against his chest, it wasn't the kind of kiss that looked like anything from the outside. It was quiet and real, and a little clumsy at first, and then not, the way real things often were. When they pulled back, she looked at him with those dark eyes, and he thought, there it is. There's the thing underneath all that careful silence. There's what she was keeping. The contract ended yesterday, she said. I know. We both stayed. We did. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned her chair slightly toward the window, and he stayed where he was on the bench, close enough that their proximity was its own thing, and they looked at the garden together in the last of the evening light. There is something that nobody tells you about surviving a hard season. The end of it doesn't look like you expect. You expect resolution. You expect the moment when everything clicks into its final shape, and you can see the whole picture clearly from above, the before and the after, the lesson you are supposed to learn. It doesn't work like that. It just keeps being days. Ethan Cole, who had signed 37 pages with a shaking hand because he had no other options, had learned this. The options had come back, slowly, imperfectly, one small thing at a time. A cup of coffee, set down, and eventually reached for. A door that opened on old hinges. A 7-year-old boy who asked if someone could become family, even if they started as strangers, and accepted the answer because it was true, and he'd suspected it was true all along and had just been waiting for the adults to catch up. The hard thing about real life is that it doesn't resolve itself into a single clear image. It keeps moving. Noah would have more medical appointments. Sophia would have more therapy sessions, more days that produced only exhaustion, and more days that produced steps. The Lennox family's legal situation would continue to move through its process at the pace of processes. Richard Lennox would remain Richard Lennox. Daniel would carry what he carried and make what he made of it, whatever that turned out to be. But in a house that had once been full of glass-cold silence, a boy was planning a chess rematch with the confidence of someone who'd learned to lose well. A fountain was running again in a garden that had been cared for even when no one was watching it. And a woman who had spent 14 months deciding the only words worth saying were the ones she wasn't allowed to say had said the word she'd been holding longest, in a conservatory full of growing things, to a man who had come in with nothing and stayed because the reasons to stay had stopped being contractual and started being real. That's not the resolution. That's the beginning of the next thing. But sometimes the beginning is enough. Sometimes you get to the beginning and recognize it for what it is. Not the end of hard, but the start of something that could bear the weight of being real. And that is its own kind of arrival. Ethan Cole had signed away 37 pages of his freedom to save his son. What he hadn't known, sitting in that expensive sitting room with the pen in his shaking hand, was that the most important thing he'd find on the other side of the signature wasn't the surgery or the settlement or the safety. It was a room full of plants and a woman who had decided to stop carrying what wasn't hers, and a boy who drew the shape of things before he saw them and was usually paying attention to the right things after all. He'd keep that. Contract or no contract, settlement or none, whatever came next in the long, ordinary difficulty of actual living, he would keep that.